Sonic Adventure 2. Released in 2001 as one of the final games to be developed on the Dreamcast, this title is often praised as the massively improved sequel to the already positively received Sonic Adventure 1. There was a lot that was riding on this game after the first installment essentially set the ground for what Sonic was supposed to play like in 3D, but Sonic Team proved that they were ultimately capable of delivering more smash hits. What with the well-designed and diversive gameplay, the tightly structured storyline, and the exceptional soundtrack, the efforts pulled by the developers paid off in spades. Sonic Adventure 2 was loved by critics and audiences alike, and to this day it's still heralded as one of, or even the very best game to come out of the Sonic franchise. Or is it? Truth be told, opinions on this game have slanted downwards quite a bit in recent years. Don't get me wrong, this is still an entry that many people greatly enjoy, but these days you're much more likely to see critiques over the less than savory elements of the game. What are my overall thoughts on the game, you ask? Well, I hate to say it, but I too think that there are quite a few blemishes that hold the game back in my eyes. Again, don't get me wrong here, I still think this is a solid 8 out of 10 experience at the end of the day. But to call it the absolute best Sonic game ever made, there are far better contenders for that one in my eyes. Now, I could just leave things there and end the video right now, but aside from the fact that that would be a very underwhelming thing to post online, I admittedly find a lot of the discourse surrounding this game to be rather disappointing, with many people glossing over some genuine criticisms of Sonic Adventure 2. I think that taking the time to analyze one of the most ambitious titles to see what worked and what didn't work is something that could open up a lot of good discussions, and I'd be interested in seeing whether people agree or disagree with my opinions. With all that being said, and without further ado, I'd like to present Sonic Adventure 2 versus the Test of Time. In order to properly put things into perspective, I think it's worth looking over the history of this game's development. I won't be going over every single detail, as there are dozens of videos on YouTube that already do a pretty good job of that, and I'll link some of them down below. However, I do want to focus on some of the most important bits I got from my own research. When you get right down to it, the primary goal of Sonic Adventure 2 when it was being developed was to take the strengths of the first game and improve on them, while also mitigating or ignoring the weaknesses. You can see this in how much more cohesive the game is on the surface, taking the better received campaigns of Sonic, Knuckles, and Gamma while scrapping the Amy and Big sections entirely. And I'm not including Tails' campaign from Sonic Adventure 1 because it's mostly just a rehash of Sonic's, except you get to fly through half the stage. In any case, with only 3 playstyles to work with as opposed to 5, that originally meant that only Sonic, Knuckles, and in place of Gamma, Dr. Eggman would be making a return. However, the story that the crew wanted to tell in the sequel ended up being more complex than they initially anticipated, to the point where a few new characters had to be introduced to the franchise. In the end, these characters would end up sharing the same playstyles as Sonic and Knuckles respectively, though since Eggman would have been left without his own alternative otherwise, it was eventually revealed that Tails would be returning to fulfill that role. When it comes to the actual designing phase of these new characters, it was a bit of a complicated process, to say the least. Shadow the Hedgehog in particular was initially envisioned as a dark Sonic of sorts, the Hedgehog's more frightful counterpart if you will. The information that I could find on concept art and the like mostly ranges from design proposals like him missing an eye, to his original name being Terios, likely taken from the Japanese term terasu, which means to reflect or compare with. Also, while we're on the topic of character designs, I'd also like to briefly point out that apparently Blaze the Cat was also conceived as a potential female rival to Sonic in this game before they decided on Shadow. However, I can't really find any sources to confirm this other than a random Twitter post that's dubious at best. Anyway, the second newcomer in Sonic Adventure 2, Rouge the Bat, had also gone through a few iterations in the conception phase. I couldn't find nearly as much on her as I could Shadow, but I do know that her name was originally Nail, strangely enough. Essentially, she and Shadow were eventually finalized as the characters that we know today, and their role in the games, as well as their overarching story, was set shortly after. Well, okay, it wasn't actually that simple. The fact that we were even getting these new characters in the first place meant that a lot of people were super excited for Sonic Adventure 2, and in general, the whole hype surrounding this game was something to behold. I remember people going absolutely insane from the trailers we were getting at the time. Even in the year leading up to release, we got like 5 different prototype or preview builds that were all sent out within a few months of each other. The trial, the preview, trial version, the May 7th, 2001 prototype, the press release builds. I cannot imagine what it was like catching wind of all these. As a major game development buff, I could probably spend all day talking about this beta content, but obviously we're mainly here to critique the actually finished product, so let's stop wasting time and really dive into it. Sonic Adventure 2 has two main story mode campaigns, Hero and Dark. Like I assume most kids did when they played the game for the first time, let's look at the Hero story first. It starts out with Sonic being held captive for a crime we don't know about for some reason that I'm sure won't be explained later, though he ends up breaking out in a hurry after he grows bored of the very subpar entertainment. Sonic spends some time on the run as a fugitive before coming across a mysterious black hedgehog, holding a Chaos Emerald in his hands of all things. At this point, we now know that Sonic has actually been convicted of a crime he didn't commit, and the clearly stolen Chaos Emerald has something to do with it. Unfortunately, before Sonic can give this hedgehog a piece of his mind, a strange new technique that we later learn is Chaos Control lets him make a speedy getaway, and Sonic is ultimately put back in police custody. Meanwhile, we transition to Knuckles and newcomer Rouge fighting over the Master Emerald. Not on Angel Island, but in the desert. Yeah, I'm a bit confused as to why this is happening in some random desert of all places, but I guess it's something I can suspend my disbelief over to an extent. While the two are arguing, Eggman swoops in and grabs the Master Emerald for himself. How does Knuckles respond to this shocking turn of events? Well, he jumps up and smashes it into pieces. And this is something that I can't suspend my disbelief over. Okay, if Knuckles was able to jump high enough to even reach the emerald in the first place, wouldn't it have made more sense to just grab the emerald itself? I mean, I know Eggman was holding it in his robotic claw thingy, but there's no way that thing would have held up against Knuckles' full strength. It feels like he's just being handed the idiot ball for the sake of the plot, forcing us players to do the dirty work of searching for all the emerald shards. Disregarding that, small lapse in logic, we cut to our third protagonist, Tails, flying over to Prison Island to try and figure out what in the world is going on with Sonic. Instead, he ends up finding Amy in a confrontation with Dr. Eggman and goes down to help. After they end up with a tie, Eggman decides to retreat, leaving Tails and Amy to team up and try and bust Sonic out of prison. They're successful in this, well, Amy is successful in this, and Sonic leaves to try and track down Shadow. The two hedgehogs eventually cross paths in the forest, leading to the very well-known and very iconic exchange that I'm sure has spawned generations of memes.
I found you, Faker!
Faker? I think you're the fake hedgehog around here. You're comparing yourself to me? Ha! You're not even good enough to be my fake.
I'll make you eat those words!
The two of them have a short quarrel, and after reaching another standstill, we learn from Eggman that the island was supposed to blow up for some reason. No, seriously, what in the world is happening here? I really hope this gets explained later on. Thankfully, Sonic manages to escape the island and meet up with Tails and Amy in the city. It's there that they witness the second iconic scene of Eggman full-on blowing up the moon. No, really, he just straight up blew up half the moon like an unhinged maniac, just as a preview of what he was going to do to Earth. Dude was out for blood in this one, I swear to God. And so, after a short discussion on what to do, the three of them eventually decide to use the Chaos Emerald Tails earned after saving Station Square in the last game to find out where Eggman is hiding, but not before they get chased once again by the authorities. Tails and Amy escape while Sonic holds off the police, and lo and behold, Knuckles ends up meeting them near the sewers. Oh yeah, Knuckles' story has kind of just been one big scavenger hunt up to this point, so I didn't really have much to say about him. In any case, Sonic and Tails deduce that Eggman is hiding up in outer space, since none of the other emeralds can be located. Fortunately, Tails manages to hack into the president's limo and learns that he has a call scheduled with Eggman. It's then that they come up with the plan of tracking down the president and tracing the call to find the doctor's location, eventually leading them right towards his secret base in the desert. After some gameplay shenanigans, the group comes across a locked launch pad that needs to be opened with a key. Sonic elects Knuckles to find the key because...
No problem. We can find it. Right, Knuckles?
What? Why do I have to find the key?
We're counting on you, buddy. The world's greatest treasure hunter.
Because he hasn't really done anything important to the plot, I guess. Well, Knuckles eventually finds all the keys, and all of them are about to take off, but Eggman drops a little surprise to halt their progress, a boss fight. Luckily, Sonic is there to beat up this egg golem all on his own, with the others just standing idly by for some reason. I know, video game logic, but it's a little weird to me, but I digress. The group uses the rocket to head into space. After a small snafu with said rocket, all the emerald shards fly out into space. Knuckles is once again relegated to yet another scavenger hunt as he goes to retrieve them, so it's back to Sonic, Tails, and Amy. The plan is to use a fake Chaos Emerald that Tails made to blow up the cannon that Eggman's planning on using by placing it with the other Chaos Emeralds, since that will reverse the energy flow of the cannon, or at least that's what Tails claims, so I'm sticking with it. Everything seems to be going according to plan, but Eggman turns out to have yet another ace on his sleeve when he puts both Tails and Amy's lives on the line, forcing Sonic to abandon the cannon to try and rescue them. Oh yeah, Knuckles also finishes up his scavenger hunt and ends up meeting Rouge out in space. After yet another standstill, Rouge, falls and almost dies? Like, girl, you have wings. You can fly. Any tension the scene might have carried is hindered by the fact that Rouge isn't actually in any danger. I mean, I know some people might claim that she was just pretending so Knuckles would come and save her, but that's never really supported by what we're shown on screen, and the audience shouldn't really have to come up with headcanons to do the work for the writers, so it just winds up coming across as a plot hole. Anyway, after being quote-unquote saved from falling, Rouge and Knuckles have a brief reconciliation after Rouge gives away all the emerald shards he collected up to that point. Knuckles uses the shards to restore the Master Emerald, and the two go their separate ways. Back at the research facility, Sonic comes in and finds Amy being held at gunpoint by Eggman, who says that she'll only be spared if Sonic gives up the last Chaos Emerald. At first, it seems like the Doctor is playing right into their hands, but nope. He knew about the fake emerald the whole time.
You thought you could trick me with that fake emerald, didn't you?
So, how did you know it wasn't the real one?
Tails!
Because you just told me, Fox Boy.
Okay, that was pretty funny, but like, how did Eggman find out about the emerald being fake? I really would like an explanation for some of the strange things that have been happening in the hero story. Anyway, with Sonic in captivity, Eggman spares absolutely no expense. He sends the escape pod Sonic is trapped in hurtling towards space, set to explode within a few moments and effectively killing off the Hedgehog for good. With the main hero out of the picture, Eggman demands that Tails hand over the real Chaos Emerald, promising to spare both him and Amy if he does so. However, Tails refuses, wanting to avenge his former role model and take down the Doctor himself. However, even after Tails comes out as the ultimate victor, Eggman manages to secretly swipe his emerald that was conveniently lying next to him on the floor. Luckily, not all hope is lost. Sonic manages to survive the escape pod exploding by using the same chaos control technique that Shadow showed him earlier, with the same fake emerald. He ends up teleporting right next to Knuckles, who he tells to go save Tails and Amy while he rushes to put the fake emerald in the cannon like they had originally intended. Along the way, he encounters Shadow, and the two of them have one final duel to determine the fate of the world. Ultimately, Sonic is the one who secures the victory, and he pulls the plug on Eggman's operations, assuring Tails and Amy that he did indeed survive and that the day has been saved, ending the story right there. And so, with the hero story wrapping up right there, it was overall not too bad all things considered. There isn't really much here that we haven't seen in other Sonic game plots up to this point. It's a pretty typical superhero action movie plot. If you can ignore a few plot holes and inconsistencies here and there, it's at least serviceable. I'll talk about more specific details in a minute, but for now, let's shift over to the more complex Dark story. This part of the story starts with Eggman breaking into Prison Island in search of a top-secret military weapon his grandfather left behind. Strangely, what he ends up finding being an anthropomorphic hedgehog in stasis, not unlike a familiar blue rodent. After being set free, the hedgehog, whose name we learn is Shadow, promises to grant the Doctor one wish if he can obtain the Chaos Emeralds. Skimming over the rehashed Knuckles and Rouge drama, Eggman eventually returns to his base in the desert and uses his computer to tune into the national news. As it turns out, his new companion has been quite busy, having already committed a robbery at a nearby bank that was holding one of the Chaos Emeralds, indirectly leading to the government trying to arrest Sonic for the crime. At last, the more intricate pieces of the plot finally start to unravel here. I actually really do enjoy the overall structure of the game's story. It spends almost the entirety of the hero's campaign making the player ask questions about what's been going on, why Sonic is in the middle of a run from the police when we first start the game, for instance. It's only by playing the Dark story does it all start to come together, and we get to see the different perspectives leading up to past events. We get to see Rouge and Eggman meeting each other and teaming up for their own ends, Shadow teaching Eggman about the Eclipse Cannon and how it can destroy entire worlds with all 7 Chaos Emeralds, their elaborate plan to steal the rest of the Chaos Emeralds and blow up an island before the military can figure out what hit them, and even a few hints that there may be something more sinister going on with Shadow. Of course, barring the added context, there are also several moments that serve to give each of the 3 characters some pretty decent developments. Shadow obviously steals the show with the mystery surrounding him, as well as his frequent flashbacks to his life on the Ark and his relationship with Maria, but Rouge also gets some time in the limelight with her being revealed as a spy from the government and tricking Eggman for her own agenda. It's far from the most unique story that's ever been written, but it's solid and engaging, and that's really all it needs to be. The story still ends relatively the same as it did in the hero story, this time with Eggman plugging in the final emerald into the console and thinking he's won while an alarm starts beeping. All in all though, I think this was a massive step up from the more formulaic plot beats of the Heroes campaign. It was a surprisingly entertaining experience seeing it all unfold while I was playing, and it made me incredibly excited to see what the final story had in store. Well, unfortunately, the last story is a bit of a letdown in my opinion. There's nothing bad about it per se, but we suddenly start rushing through all these important events without any real setup from earlier plot beats, and the pacing winds up feeling all over the place. We start out with Eggman trying to figure out why his master plan to rule the world is going awry, only to find a mysterious video file belonging to his grandfather, Gerald Robotnik. Suddenly, all of the characters, sans Shadow, regroup here, and Rouge reveals that the Ark is currently falling straight towards the Earth at a rapid pace, and that they'll all be dead in a matter of minutes if it continues. Then, the same video from Eggman's computer is immediately broadcast to the entire world, and we're officially pushed into the final act. Alas, this is where it all starts to fall apart. To set the stakes of the last story into motion, the game starts throwing all this exposition right in our face about Gerald's revenge plan after the death of his daughter, along with trying to hastily explain Shadow's origins. But all I'm thinking about here is, how? How is this man able to get a video taken right before his execution to broadcast to the entire world once the final emerald was put in the cannon? How is a dead man's diary conveniently lying around in a hard drive with a page about Shadow? Why is the Ultimate Life Form's prototype a Biolizard that was never alluded to until now? Why is said Biolizard capable of using freaking Chaos Control to fuse with the Ark? These are important parts of the plot that go completely unexplained, and it's not like we didn't have time to answer these questions. The hero story, and even the dark story to an extent, had a lot of filler scenes that could have easily been retooled to make room for some more exposition. Instead of having Knuckles on a scavenger hunt for 90% of the game, for instance, you could have given him a way to contribute to the plot that involves uncovering some of this information. I really don't like using the term show, don't tell on its own, as I feel like there's a time and a place for both depending on the circumstances, but this is really just a case of doing too much telling at the very end, and not enough showing at an earlier point. Anyway, the group's plan to neutralize the Chaos Emeralds doesn't work when the Biolizard, again, somehow manages to achieve Chaos Control, and uses that power to fuse with the Ark. Due to this contrived turn of events, Sonic and Shadow will need a bit of a power boost to save the day this time. Together, they use the Chaos Emeralds to achieve their super forms in what is probably one of the most well-known scenes in the entire franchise. After finally defeating the final hazard as a team, Sonic and Shadow use one big Chaos Control to warp the Ark right back into orbit, stopping its crash course towards the Earth. However, such a time-consuming move seems to cause Shadow to suffer a backlash, and he transforms as he falls straight back to Earth. If nothing else, he finds solitude in being able to fulfill Maria's promise, even if it came at the expense of his own life. Sonic manages to return to his friends in one piece, and while it's clear the day has been saved, it's still overall a bittersweet victory, and there's no denying that everyone is a bit shaken up by what they've all seen. I actually really enjoy the conversations that each of the characters have with each other as the credits roll, just letting all of them express their thoughts after everything that's happened. Even if it wasn't without a few losses, they're all still alive, and that's at least something worth celebrating. For now, all they can do is rest up for the next adventure. So that was interesting. For the most part, the story here was decent, and at the very least engaging on its own, divorced from the actual gameplay. But Jesus Christ, what in the world was that final act? It takes the ongoing issue of having little plot holes that sprout up throughout the story and just cranks it up to 11, leaving me seriously wondering if I zoned out somewhere throughout one of the stories and missed some vital information. And that's not even getting into the second main problem I have with the story, which is the use of the characters. The game seems to be wildly inconsistent with the screen time and development it chooses to give to all the main characters, particularly in the hero story, and it can make the narrative feel especially disjointed at points. I'll try to go through each of them one by one so you see what I mean. Starting with the main character himself, Sonic the Hedgehog. Fortunately, I don't have too many problems with him in this game. He fills a very standard role as the superhero protagonist who is fully committed on saving the day no matter the cost, but there aren't really any significant flaws in the way he's used here. Of course, as the main character, he inherently gets the largest amount of screen time, but the contributions he makes to the plot are indeed meaningful, so again, no complaints here. Unfortunately, we start seeing some problems shortly after. Compared to Sonic himself, every other character from the hero story gets mishandled in some way by the narrative. Probably the least problematic here is Tail. On the surface, he serves a pretty decent role as the main strategist on the hero's side, as well as the one who makes the calculated moves like hijacking the president's car or using a fake emerald to trick Eggman. I would also be remiss if I didn't mention his big character moment of facing the Doctor himself. It's a great way to build on the foundation that the first game set for him. Aside from that though, I feel like Tails is just a bit too passive in this game, by which I mean he's sort of just hanging around with Sonic and Amy most of the time, and he never really gets any individual development divorced from the main story, with the exception of the aforementioned plot beat of him finding Eggman. Now, on its own, this isn't a super big issue, but in a story like this where it feels like every character is supposed to have their own arc going on in the background, it can seem a bit like Tails is backtracking in some ways, especially when Adventure 1 managed to accomplish what Sonic Adventure 2 is trying to do in spades. Knuckles is just completely pointless for 90% of the story. He spends most of his time completely separated from the actual important plot that all the heroes are participating in, and instead goes coasting around for emerald charts to fix something that he himself broke. Like, when I said I wanted these characters to have their own story going on, I didn't mean stories that made them practically irrelevant to anything else. If it weren't for his role in the final act, you could cut him out of the game entirely and absolutely nothing would change. Hell, you could even argue that he's useless in the final act too, since their plan to neutralize the Chaos Emeralds fails because the Bile-Lizard waves its magic plot contrivance wand and fuses with the Ark. When it comes to Amy's role in the story, she isn't quite as bad as Knuckles, but that's not really a high bar to clear, and she really only contributes to the plot 3 different times. 2 of those times aren't even things that are unique to her as a character. Like with breaking Sonic out of prison, Tails was already flying there to do just that, not to mention the fact that it's never even explained how Amy got to Prison Island in the first place. Her conversation with Shadow is also another miss for me, unfortunately. I definitely get what they were trying to go for here, and I appreciate the effort to give Amy a win, something that she desperately needed more of in this game, but it just feels too rushed for me to be fully on board with it. She gives a short speech to Shadow about how, people are good even though they're selfish, okay. It prompts Shadow to have another flashback to Maria, and he's suddenly on the good side in the blink of an eye. To me, it feels less like an important character building moment for Amy, and more like yet another thing that had to be manufactured by the plot. Fortunately, Eggman, Rouge, and Shadow fare a bit better in this department, though I still have a few issues. Like Sonic, Eggman also acts as a stand-in for a typical archetype, this time as the sinister villain trying to take over the world with the use of his latest scheme. However, I think the game also generally gives the Doctor enough individual material to keep him from being a note-for-note rehash of the villain trope. He blows up half of the moon as a threat towards the people on Earth, threatens to kill Amy while holding her at gunpoint, and even the fact that he's so committed to world conquest that he's digging through a military base for his grandfather's old weapons at the start of the game speaks volumes about how cold and calculating he can be. This is definitely Eggman at his most entertaining. Likewise, Rouge also gets a pretty good deal here. While the whole thing with her being a secret agent at Gun is a little wonky, especially since she gets attacked by one of their soldiers at one point, it's a decent way of fleshing out her background and giving her an important role in the story. Oh, and it's also really fun to see her dishing out sassy remarks towards the other characters whenever she's on screen. As for my thoughts on Shadow the Hedgehog, well, I know that I praised him earlier for the developments we got from his point of view, but I honestly don't think it was enough. There's too little material for me to really root for him as a character, and considering that he's supposed to be an incredibly major player in the story, that's a problem. It also doesn't help that he feels strangely inactive throughout the narrative, with most of the legwork being done by Rouge and Eggman. Granted, this isn't nearly as bad as it is with Tails. He still has noteworthy things to do when he's not contributing to the overarching plot, but again, I feel like he needed so much more than what he was actually given. With all the criticisms I had with the final act, I feel like a large part of the problem was that the most important character in question wasn't given enough focus. Even having some of the other characters learn more about Shadow on their own would have helped a lot, especially considering that, with the exception of the 2 times Amy talked to Shadow directly, Sonic is the only person not aligned with the Dark story to interact with him. I mean, I guess Knuckles also did near the end, but it didn't really amount to anything significant. I know that I've been a little negative in this section, and honestly, in a vacuum, most of these issues aren't really that serious, but considering all the problems I had with Sonic Adventure 2's story overall, it's hard not to notice how all these little things start to build up and cut holes in the narrative. This isn't a bad story by any means, and for the most part it manages to hold its own decently well, but it feels like it needed another draft or two to really tie things together. Alright, so I've been talking a lot about the game's story, but there's way more to any video game than how it presents a narrative. What we're really here to judge is the gameplay and whether or not it manages to be entertaining, so let's get into it. As mentioned before, Sonic Adventure 2 is split into 3 main gameplay styles: the action stages of Sonic and Shadow, the mech stages of Tails and Eggman, and the treasure hunting stages of Knuckles and Rouge. In theory, these are all meant to serve as 3 completely distinctive experiences that help diversify the gameplay loop and give each character their own identity. With that being said, I have some thoughts about the execution. Starting out with the action stages, well, it's safe to say that they're pretty good, pretty great even. As the core Sonic gameplay we all know and love, this is the most consistently enjoyable part of Sonic Adventure 2 by a landslide. Similarly to the game that came before, these stages are primarily an attempt to apply the gameplay loop of the classic games into a 3D environment. Less emphasis is placed on the use of momentum to traverse the stage, and more emphasis is put on the speed and platforming aspects. There does seem to be an attempt to introduce more of a consistent flow to the levels, rather than one that requires a bit of practice to get the hang of like the classics. I think what makes the difference here, though, is how many more liberties are taken in Adventure 2 as opposed to the first one. SA1 toyed with a few of these ideas, but this is the game that really ran with how much different Sonic could be in 3D, while still keeping the core of his gameplay. For instance, the levels in this game are considerably more linear than the ones from the first game, which is a far cry from the classic games that seem to reward you with different pathways based on how well you took advantage of your momentum. Understandably, there have been a few criticisms about how this way of tackling level design can seem reductive in retrospect, but I actually think it works to the game's benefit. Like I said before, the main goal of the action stages seems to be giving players a more consistent sense of speed and flow, as opposed to having to earn it. Additionally, the same idea of more competently handling the levels by mastering the mechanics is still very much present, just applied a little differently with things like the ranking system. What I'm getting at is, exploring the level and finding alternate pathways in Sonic Adventure 2 doesn't seem to be quite as important to maintaining optimal paths, but they still provide the same sense of speed you see in the prior games, and mastering the mechanics is still just as great of a reward. In other words, playing as Sonic or Shadow is fun. It has all the things that I love in an adventure-style Sonic game, and even though the less than stellar camera controls and choppy physics are starting to show their age after years, and some of the stages are just plain not fun, Crazy Gadget still haunts my nightmares, is without a doubt the best part of the game. Unfortunately, the other 2 gameplay styles don't even come close to matching up in my opinion. The mech stages are just consistently mediocre. Tails and Eggman trade in high-speed movement and varied level design for clunky maneuvers and tedious progression, and they both suffer greatly for it. The only thing you do in these stages is walk around at painfully slow speeds, endure some painfully slow platforming, and press the B button to shoot at things. There's no real substance to any of it, and it's such a far cry from what you would expect in a Sonic game for no apparent reason. For what it's worth, I'd say that Eggman came out as the overall winner with his stages. Not only are his levels just designed better, but I'd even argue some of them were actually fairly enjoyable. I thought Cosmic Wall in particular was a pretty fun stage with its gravity gimmicks and all the enemies you get to shoot down. It's not nearly enough to save the mech levels, but it's at least something. Tails though? Yeah, dude just gets some of the most disappointing material in this one. I wanted to highlight a stage fist that I thought was good, but I really can't think of one that I would place any higher than tolerable. Mission Street lacks anything truly memorable. Hidden Base is bogged down with platforming that only highlights how clunky the mechs are, and the less said about Eternal Engine the better. It also doesn't help that he gets this weird kart racing segment when he's trying to chase the president on the road instead of the air for some reason, and it's just so boring. Like, I'll happily take Sonic Riders over this any day. And finally, we have the treasure hunting. I'm so excited, you guys. Can you tell how excited I am? Woo! Okay, maybe I'm being a bit crude here, but these stages just frustrate me. I mean, the idea of having 1/3 of the game be a glorified scavenger hunt is already skating on thin ice with me, but every single stage here is laughably inconsistent, more than any other style we've covered thus far. It ranges from passable stages like Wild Canyon and Dry Lagoon to the freaking abysmal Mad Space. Oh my god, what is this? I feel like I need to go through each stage here one by one. Unlike the last two styles, every stage here suffers from its own unique issue, and I really just want to articulate why this all adds up to be my least favorite gameplay style out of the three. Alright, so Wild Canyon and Dry Lagoon are pretty decent stages by all accounts. There's enough open-ended space to help keep things engaging and flexible, while also not going too far in the other direction and making the general exploration more of a tedious chore. At least not yet. There are still problems, of course, but they're more on a fundamental level, and, well, I'm not the biggest fan of the treasure hunting in concept if you couldn't tell. Likewise, Pumpkin Hill is another successful— oh my god, those ghosts, I hate those ghosts! Pumpkin Hill is another successful stage. Compared to the previous two, it gives you a little more room to work with, but also introduces a few obstacles and hazards to help keep things fresh. Like those ghosts, unfortunately. Sadly, this is where we start seeing some problems, although I'd argue that Aquatic Mind and Security Hall are at least tolerable if the RNG is in your favor. Still, the problem here is that everything just feels too segregated. Unlike the previous stages, which allowed room for exploring the area in your own way, the game now starts boxing you into these narrow passageways, forcing you to navigate a specific path to find the emeralds. Also, the fact that Rouge is given 5 minutes to do her stage, I mean, it's obviously not impossible, but it's not doing her level any favors.
5 minutes should be plenty. Here I go. Sure, Jan.
Things get even worse in Death Chamber and Egg Quarters, where you're now trapped in even more heavily confined spaces while searching for keys. The simple act of trying to make your way through these levels is like trying to find your way out of a giant maze, and not a particularly fun one. I get it, this is supposed to be a hidden pyramid base, it's not supposed to have a lot of space to run around in, but like, forcing players to move through these stages in one specific way just feels incredibly counterintuitive to what the treasure hunting is trying to accomplish. Especially when only being able to pick up one key at a time means that backtracking is practically inevitable. Oh yeah, I haven't even talked about the Emerald Radar yet. As a way to artificially increase the difficulty of these stages, the radar was made to only track one emerald at a time, as opposed to Sonic Adventure 1 where all 3 of them could be tracked at once. I can at least make peace with this change on stages like the aforementioned Wild Canyon or Pumpkin Hill, but having to find these items one by one while dealing with the likes of Death Chamber? Nah, this shit ain't fun at all. Oh ho ho ho, but the funny thing is, we haven't even reached the worst treasure hunting stage. That title belongs to the dreaded Meteor Herd and Mad Space. Oh god, these stages. Remember what I said before about how stages like Dry Lagoon had the perfect amount of open-endedness that allowed for engaging exploration? These last 2 levels are a perfect example of how that same open-endedness can become a massive problem. Simply put, these levels are way too big. They're annoying to get through because you have so much ground to cover to the point that it can take ages before you even get your radar in the green. These levels are slow, tedious, and just plain unfun. Meteor Herd is already bad enough, but Mad Space somehow takes it to an entirely different level of bad. What with it being even more spaced out than its hero counterpart, making you constantly fight atrocious gravity mechanics, reversing some of the hints for no reason at all, and suffering from the issues I already talked about with the radar, I genuinely think this is the worst level in the entire game. Every single thing I don't like about the treasure hunting stages is cranked up to 11 here, giving me an experience that I struggle to say anything positive about. And look, even though I've been bashing the treasure hunting and mech shooting a fair bit in this video, I really don't want to make anyone feel bad for liking them. More power to you if you wholeheartedly enjoy these levels. The problem is that the idea of having these gameplay styles in the first place was already doomed to fail. See, when I play a Sonic game, I expect to play as Sonic the Hedgehog, or at the very least I expect to have a gameplay loop that stays true to the core Sonic gameplay the whole way through. I expect to go through fast-paced levels with the objective of getting from A to B, and maybe having some extra abilities like flight or gliding depending on which character I'm playing as. In contrast, having gameplay styles centered around looking for items in sandbox type environments or navigating shooter-like levels, things that are so radically different from the core Sonic gameplay, means that about 2/3 of this game is working at a fundamental disadvantage, and it really does show with a large gap in quality. At the end of the day, even the best levels in the mech and treasure hunting campaigns are nowhere near as good as the Sonic and Shadow levels, primarily because they feel out of place in this game from a purely conceptual standpoint. If I wanted to play a game about scavenger hunters shooting people in a mech, there are tons of games that could fill that niche, and I don't think Sonic should be one of them. These gameplay styles just do not have a place in a game series about a blue hedgehog that's supposed to speed through the levels. As always, I can appreciate the attempts to give Sonic's friends some time in the limelight by making them playable, but if every single character is going to play completely differently from Sonic himself, aka the main attraction, then that's undoubtedly going to turn people off. Again, it's totally fine if you like these levels, but it's inevitable that they're not going to be as positively received because of the fact that they're so different. Well, with the 3 main gameplay styles covered, we can now take a look at some of the other aspects. Let's start with the bosses, because, honestly, I don't have a lot to say about them. Most of them are fine, all things considered. I feel like they're a bit too easy in the grand scheme of things, and some of them can be kinda tedious, like the character battles, but I don't have any major complaints. I just had a few quick notes that I wanted to add here. Firstly, I found the final boss to be surprisingly underwhelming. Don't get me wrong, I don't think it's bad or anything, but once you know what to do, it can get pretty repetitive. Also, this is a bit of a hot take, but I'm not too crazy about Live and Learn. The Titan songs from Frontiers are infinitely better in my opinion. I also wanted to say that I kind of like how Sonic and Eggman fight the same boss at one point, and yet this is the only time in the game where both characters go about it in entirely separate ways, with both of them being fairly enjoyable. I don't know, I just think it's interesting how the mech shooting seemed to complement the boss fight in a similarly engaging way to the action. I guess Omochao just unalived himself right in front of my eyes. RIP, you guys! The last thing I want to add is this little exchange that happens in the Knuckles boss fight while I was recording footage, and I just thought it was funny.
Now witness my power. I must protect the Master
Now
Emerald.
give back those jewels.
Next up, we've got the multiplayer modes. Essentially, these are just the gameplay segments I've already talked about made up into different competitions, like how the action stages are a race to the finish, or the treasure hunting is a race to find the most emerald shards. If I'm being honest here, this is an amazing multiplayer mode. It genuinely gives Sonic Adventure 2 a lot of extra points, and I wholeheartedly believe that this is still the best multiplayer mode we've ever had from a Sonic game. The racing mode and multiplayer is pretty good, as to be expected, but the treasure hunting and mech shooting are actually really great here as well, and I honestly think that this is where these alternate gameplay styles should have stayed. Treasure hunting just seems like something that would be great for a competitive multiplayer game, and the 2-player mode fills that niche wonderfully. I mean, maybe it's just the fact that having special moves to give you ways to screw up your opponent makes these stages that much more engaging, but I had infinitely more fun in the multiplayer versions of these levels compared to the single player campaigns. The shooting levels do kinda get the short end of the stick here, since they're basically just rehashes of the mech character bosses, though I still think that having the other player not being controlled by AI makes this an alright battle mode of sorts. Overall, Sonic Adventure 2 has a great multiplayer, and it's something that I always come back to whenever I play this game. Last but certainly not least is the Chao Garden. Everyone loves the Chao Garden. I haven't met a single person who doesn't love the Chao Garden. I don't love it as much as some other people do, but I still freaking love the Chao Garden. These adorable bundles of adorableness, they are wonderful. They are sacred. They must be protected from the world. Seeing them grow up and learn all these amazing things, like how to swim, putting them in races and karate, the way they start dancing in your arms whenever you pick them up, even the way they start walking up to you for attention when their happiness level is high enough, I just love it all. I love it all. So, yeah, I think it's safe to say that the Chao Garden is another great part of Sonic Adventure 2, and another thing that gives it a lot of extra points. I mean, I can understand why you don't see them in the later games, especially with how rushed a lot of them are, but the Chao Garden just has that special type of charm that I can't help but love, and it's no wonder why people are clamoring for it to return in future titles. I just wish they weren't so aggressive about it sometimes. Jesus. Like I said before in the development section, Sonic Adventure 2's main goal was to improve on Sonic Adventure 1's strengths and mitigate or outright abolish its flaws. Now, to the game's credit, it does this successfully in several areas. The aforementioned multiplayer modes and upgraded Chao Garden are both great progressions of what came before, and the game overall seems a lot more polished with its design and mechanics. However, the way that the game goes about some of its changes is pretty wonky, to say the least. I mean, for all of Sonic Adventure 1's faults, one thing that I can give it credit for is the decision to give every character their own storyline and stages. If you just want to play Sonic and get the core high-speed gameplay, then Sonic is the only character you're gonna play. You're not being forced to switch the way you approach the story mid-game. Even though it doesn't save the already flawed concept of having these heavily altered gameplay loops to begin with, it's a lot easier to deal with when they're not battling with Sonic's gameplay for focus. In contrast, Sonic Adventure 2 forces you to switch between these characters constantly throughout the entire story. To be fair, this wouldn't be such a big deal if the other characters all played relatively similar to Sonic and Shadow, but the fact that they don't just means that the highest of the action stages are constantly getting bogged down by levels like Eternal Engine and Mad Space, and the overall campaign winds up feeling all over the place in terms of distribution, like how Eggman and Rouge get the bulk of the stages in the Dark Story while Shadow himself only gets 4. In addition to the lack of consistency with these gameplay styles, the efforts made to flesh them out in Sonic Adventure 2 actually ended up doing more harm than good. I talked briefly about how Sonic and Shadow's levels received a bit of criticism for being considerably more linear than previous games, but the other characters are even worse in this regard. A common criticism of the SA1 Knuckles stages was that they were too short and too easy, so the crew decided to make the radar only detect one emerald at a time and give the player significantly less room to work with. Gamma stages in SA1 went by too fast and just had you shoot everything in the level, so the crew made the mechs slower and clunkier and had them focus on trying to shoot everything in the level along with getting from A to B like a regular Sonic stage. Like, you see where I'm going with this, right? In their efforts to improve on these two gameplay styles, they end up making the treasure hunting more tedious and complicated, and the mech shooting more boring and janky. All of this just adds up to create a game that is, quite frankly, lacking cohesion in several areas. And it's especially strange when Sonic Adventure 1 actually handled this problem much better in comparison. I mean, sure, that game has its own problems with some of the other characters not being nearly as fun as Sonic and cutting corners by using bits and pieces from Sonic's levels, but at the very least they were considerably shorter campaigns that weren't constantly hopping into other characters' stories. There was a post I saw on social media a little while ago that I think sums up this issue perfectly. Going fishing with Big may have been infinitely dumber and more absurd than anything in Sonic Adventure 2, but at least it took up a much smaller portion of the game. And so, we've circled all the way back to the conclusion, and well, I've been a bit more negative than I would have liked. I know I keep saying this, but I still think that Sonic Adventure 2 is a solid 8 out of 10 game with lots of material that's worth going back to. It's a good game. At times it borders on being a great game, but I just can't say that it's the best Sonic game when I take a look at all of its flaws. The story is decent, but it's riddled with plot holes and pacing issues. 2/3 of the gameplay is passable at best, with genres that really have no place in a Sonic game. And while this game does generally succeed with being an improvement over Sonic Adventure 1, it doesn't accomplish this without backtracking in several areas. I think this would have been a great time for Sonic Team to, again, take what worked with Sonic Adventure 2 and fix the things that didn't work. Remove the divisive playstyles like treasure hunting and mech shooting, incorporate Sonic's friends into the core gameplay loop while also giving them unique abilities to justify their playability, polish up the action stages and remove some of the jank, such as only having 2 buttons to work with for like 3 or 4 actions, and maybe revisit the Child Garden. Alas, they instead elected to move on to an entirely different style in Sonic Heroes. I mean, it worked. The game was successful and one that I enjoyed, but they just moved to something entirely different instead of polishing up the decent base that they did have. Then they did it again with Shadow the Hedgehog, and then when they finally tried to go back to the adventure formula with Sonic 06, well, we all know how that one went. So I suppose my final verdict is that Sonic Adventure 2 is a good but flawed game, and one that could have led to an even greater follow-up had Sonic Team actually committed to improving on it. It would be a long time before we would even see the adventure formula make a spiritual return in the form of Sonic Frontiers. But that's a story for another day. Anyway, I hope you all enjoyed this deep dive into a game I've had a bit of a complicated history with. And I hope I wasn't too harsh here. I really do love this game. It just could have been a lot better in my opinion. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below and whether or not you disagree. Just please try to be civil. With all that being said, I hope all of you have a wonderful day and I hope you'll stay tuned for more content in the future.